help me give a warm PorcFest welcome to a hero, a man of courage, the man of the hour, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
A lot of people who value freedom in the United States of America. I had, in August of 2020, when the pandemic really started, when they were just doing the lockdowns and all the other stuff, I went to Germany and gave a speech in Berlin. And the estimates of the crowd there were 1.3 million. It was the most extraordinary crowd. It looked like Woodstock. There were people from all over Europe, people from the MC was a man from Ghana. We had Buddhist priests, we had Hare Krishna people, good people from every kind of ideology, left, right. First one coming together and saying, you know, somebody is stealing our freedom, and this is something we all need to unite about. The crowd, again, they said 1.3 million people, and nobody was wearing a mask. That was, at that time, that was a kind of heresy. And there was an NBC crew from the United States there, and they were all masked up. And they said to me, why aren't you wearing a mask? Why aren't you scared of COVID? And I said, there's things that I'm a lot more frightened about than COVID. He said, what is that? I said, that would be losing my constitutional rights and having my children grow up in America where they don't enjoy the kind of rights that I took for granted as a boy. And we saw during COVID this extraordinary thing happen to our country, where all of a sudden people, the capacity, the fear, the orchestrated fear, almost disabled the capacity for critical thought among so many Americans, people who we loved, people who were family members, people who we grew up with, and we all assumed shared the same value systems that we did. But all of a sudden they were okay with censorship, and the government began, going through the Constitution. They started out with the censorship, which they began very, very early. I started encountering it by the end of January of 2020. Things that I said would disappear from Instagram posts. And by the way, I'm accused of passing misinformation. But I would, misinformation, as we know, is just a euphemism for anything that departs from government orthodoxies. Accuracy or inaccuracy in their nomenclature. And we know this because they acknowledge that in the Twitter files, and they acknowledge that in the emails that we now have between the government officials and Facebook, where Facebook is saying, well, you're asking us to censor things that are true, but that they may affect, they may be dissenting against government policies, and they all agree that that's right. So we saw the right of free expression. Hamilton, Addison, and Adams all said we put it in the First Amendment because all of the other rights are dependent on that. If a government has the capacity to silence its critics, it has license for any kind of atrocity. And that is what unfolded as soon as they found out that Americans would put up with constraints, with government-ordered constraints on free speech. They began this attack, this assault against all the other amendments, all the other rights in our Constitution. The other, or the second leg of the First Amendment is freedom of worship. They closed down every church in this country for a year, with no scientific citation, no due process, no notice and comment, public hearings, no environmental impact statement. And by the way, you could do things for emergency, but you can still go through the democratic process. You could still have comment sections and public hearings and environmental impact statements. And none of that was even tried. I've spent 40 years suing companies and agencies for trying to subvert or shortcut the regulatory process, part of democracy. Now, there was a big question throughout our country's history about whether regulatory agencies were even constitutional because they were outside of the democratic process. You know, the Congress, yes, can pass laws. The Constitution says Congress can pass laws. The court said, okay, regulatory agencies can pass laws, which is outside of the Constitution, but you have to incorporate a regulatory process, and it has to be shown, which means you have to do an environment, you have to do a public notice. You publish what the law is going to say, so that everybody knows in the newspaper of records, ways to calculate that every citizen who is affected by this new law will learn about it in advance. You give the public a period of comment. You do an environmental impact statement that outlines all of your scientific citations and all of the expert opinions that underlie it. You look at the cost-benefit analysis in every sector of society. You look at whether there's alternatives that can accomplish the same objective that are less burdensome to the public. These are all legal requirements, and then you have a 60 or 90-day comment period in which the public, every member of the public can comment, and all those comments have to be responded to. Oh, for example, if there's a mask regulation, and I own a kayak company, and I say to the government, I can't force my clients to put on masks because it could kill them in an emergency. That would be the kind of comment the government would say, okay, then we'll carve out something for outdoor sports or something like that. That's why that's why you have those comment periods. And none of that was done. And then you have an administrative finding that's published by the administrative judge. And then that's appealable. So the whole thing to a court, up to the Supreme Court. So it's all incorporated in the democratic process, but in this case, it was all forgotten. And we just had one bureaucrat who had been 50 years in office and never been elected, who says 1 week put on masks, and the next week, or 1 week masks don't work, which he's saying in private and publicly, but privately he's advising his boss at HHS, don't put it on, they don't work. Oh, later he said, I just said that to reduce the demand on masks. But he was telling that to his boss. You personally should not put on a mask because they don't work. And he's a 50-year bureaucrat who's never been elected, who then, mandates all these tasks to the American people, completely separated from the democratic process. So after they did religion, and they went after freedom of assembly, which is the third leg of the First Amendment. We were all told to social distance from each other. And then they go after property rights. They closed 3.3 million businesses with no due process and no just compensation, in violation of the Fifth Amendment. And then they go after jury trials. Oh, here's what the Seventh Amendment says. It says, no American shall be denied right of trial before a jury of his peers in cases or controversies exceeding $25. There is no pandemic exception. They didn't put that in the United States Constitution. And by the way, the framers knew all about epidemics. There were two epidemics during the Revolutionary War. One of them decimated the malaria epidemic that decimated the armies of Virginia, and then a smallpox epidemic that actually took place in this state, Vermont and New Hampshire, with Benedict Arnold's armies that were on their way to Montreal. And they ended up taking Montreal, but having to leave because they didn't have the manpower to support the occupation. So Canada would have been part of the United States, but for that smallpox epidemic, arguably. And the framers of the Constitution knew all about that. Well, they knew about epidemics, and not only that, but between 1780 and at the end of the Revolution and the ratification of the Constitution, there were devastating epidemics in every city in the United States. There were smallpox epidemics, yellow fever, cholera epidemics that killed tens of thousands of people, including family members of many of the framers of the Constitution. And yet they did not put an epidemic exception in the United States Constitution. The Constitution was written for hard times. During the Civil War, when the Confederacy was sending up spies and provocateurs to the northern cities to drum up draft riots, which were devastating the morale of the northern states, at a time when the Union was about to fall apart altogether, Abraham Lincoln knew who these people were, and they were arresting them when they came into the cities and holding them without trial because there wasn't evidence. They knew who they were. So he suspended habeas corpus. And Justice Taney, who's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, said he can't do it. It doesn't matter. It does not matter that the life of the Union is at stake. It doesn't matter that the lives of tens of thousands of Americans are at stake. You cannot suspend the Constitution. Yeah! As I said, that doesn't mean we can't have emergencies in this country, declared emergencies, and have temporary suspensions. But not for a year, not for 2 years. And by the way, you do democratic processes along the way. And then we got rid of, the Fourth Amendment prohibitions against warrantless searches and seizures, with all this intrusive track and trace, and we have to get our medical records in order to go into the public square, in order to leave our home. All of these things were against the American tradition, against the Constitution, and they should have been troubling to every American, and especially the press. And instead, the mainstream media in this country, which has always been the forefront of the guardians and the protectors of our Constitution, particularly for its expression, free expression, all of a sudden, they forgot their role as the role which I learned in hand, that the role of the press is a posture of fierce skepticism towards government proclamations. And they should have known that. The New York Times had to apologize to the American people for supporting its role on the run-up to the Iraq War, because they believed government officials. And they never learned the lesson, which is that the role of the press is to speak truth to power, not to function as propagandists for the powerful. About something that should trouble all Americans, that we should ask questions about. And people are going to say, the press, the mainstream media who's here today is going to report that I did paranoid conspiracy theories, which is what they always say. But I'm just going to tell you facts, okay? And then I'm going to ask you, are these things that we ought to be able to talk about in democracy? Are these things that we ought to be questioning? Is that reasonable? And we ought to be questioning. And the thing that I'm going to talk about is the role of the intelligence agencies in the pandemic, and in almost every aspect of the pandemic. which itself, I think, should be surprising to most Americans. This is a public health crisis. This should be the province of NIH. Why are the intelligence agencies playing this role? Why is it that in the organizational charts that were classified before they were declassified and handed over to PRPAC, which is the FDA committee that ran Operation Warp Speed, and they declassified it in order to show it to that committee, so we now have it. Why is it that the lead agency in COVID planning was the National Security Council? Why is it the lead agency for operations was the Pentagon? Why shouldn't they be FDA and CDC and NIH? Why weren't they regulating the health crisis? And on the NSC, the chief security advisor of the NSC is Avril Haines. Now, Avril Haines has played a role in pandemic response for decades. And Avril Haines was, just so that you know who she is she was the deputy director of the CIA, and she's the one who masterminded the cover-up of the destruction of the torture tapes at Guantanamo. And then when the Senate was investigating those crimes for Americans to torture people, the CIA was bugging the Senate committee, which is utterly illegal, and she masterminded the cover-up of that crime. So she, and instead of being punished, criminally prosecuted, she was promoted to the highest spy in America, the Director of National Intelligence, the DNI, which means she takes the prime seat of the National Security Council. Where else have you seen Avril Haines? Well, if you read the last chapter of my book, which I think on Fauci, which I think is the most disturbing chapter, it goes through this history of pandemic preparedness simulations that occurred beginning in 2001, and that predicted a series of pandemics. The first one in May of 2001, which was called Dark Winter, predicted a smallpox attack on Washington. And this was 5 months before 9/11, and a week after 9/11, you had an anthrax attack on the U.S. Capitol and on media outlets around the country. And I think 5 people died, 22 people were infected. This was at a time immediately after 9/11. Somebody took the Patriot Act off the shelf. And let me give you a little background on this. We had a bioethics program after World War II. And the first act of the CIA in its history was called Operation Paperclip, which was launched in 1947, about a week after the CIA was founded. So the CIA OSS had been dismantled after World War II because our leadership, Republicans and Democrats, agreed that having a secret spy agency was inconsistent with democracy. Secret spy agencies were associated in the American mind with the KGB in Russia, with Stasi in East Germany, with Savak in Iraq, or in Iran, with the Gestapo, etc. But they were inconsistent with the democratic system. So people were very nervous. People were very nervous on both parties about authorizing this. In the end, Truman allowed it reluctantly and signed it into existence, but as an espionage agency, which is spying, which is information gathering. It's not pretty tricks. And that came later through a bunch of crazy machinations. But the first act of the CIA, the first project was Operation Paperclip, which was bringing the Nazi scientists who had worked on missiles, nuclear weapons, missiles and bioweapons over the United States to Fort Detrick and to some of the other high security labs in Texas and elsewhere in our country to begin developing a bioweapons program, and to get the Japanese scientists, who were the only ones who ever actually used bioweapons against the Chinese and killed many, tens, hundreds of thousands of Chinese before and during World War II with bioweapons. And they had the most extensive program, and they got those Japanese scientists also to come over to our country, and they opened labs in Japan, which we occupied at that point, and developed bioweapons there. And the CIA was in charge with the Navy and some other Pentagon agencies of developing the bioweapons program. By 1969, they had achieved what they bragged about in internal documents as nuclear equivalency. They could kill huge populations of people around the world at a cost of about 29 cents per death, per life. This is what they were bragging on, nuclear equivalency. And so it was very, very dangerous. And a lot of people said we shouldn't be developing bioweapons. Why? Because once you develop them, you have now a blueprint that anybody in the world can use. So it is the poor man's nuclear bomb. Nuclear weapons, no matter, even if you have a formula, it takes huge economic commitments and technical proficiency to develop one. But if you have the formula for a bioweapon, you can make it in a garage. So a lot of critics within the Pentagon said we shouldn't even be doing this, because what we're doing is we're making these weapons accessible to people who can use them against us and who have very, very low risk themselves. And so in 1969, Richard Nixon did something extraordinary. He went to Fort Detrick and he announced the end of the bioweapons program. Unilaterally, the American government was going to stop developing bioweapons no matter what anybody else in the world did. And then 3 years later, they signed the bioweapons treaty with most of the major nations in the world, and we're not going to make bioweapons anymore. But there were this cohort of people within the CIA. The CIA, Nixon closed Fort Detrick. They turned it over to NIH. And they destroyed all the bioweapons. But before they went, destroyed it, the CIA went in and got cultures of all of them and moved them to warehouses in New York and elsewhere. And there were an angry group of people in the CIA, the Pentagon, who for many years were trying to restart the program, and they began doing it illegally. The Russians found out they did it too. But they were doing it secretly, and it was very, very low profile. And in 2001, after the 9/11 attack, somebody pulled off the shelf the Patriot Act, 342 pages. I want you to guess who the only member of Congress was who actually read that act. There was only one copy provided. Everybody else voted on it without having read it. And one of the things that nobody knew was in there was a provision that did not directly revoke the Geneva Convention and the Bioweapons Treaty. The Geneva Convention made a hanging offense, a capital offense to do bioweapons development. But you could still do research. You couldn't use a bioweapon under Geneva. So, but the bioweapons charter that Nixon said got rid of it all. You couldn't even study it anymore. And the only guy to read it was him. And what the Patriot Act said in this hidden provision is that yes, we still ascribe to Geneva and we ascribe to the Bioweapons Charter, but any federal official who violates those treaties cannot be prosecuted. That's what the Patriot Act said. So it restarted the bioweapons arms race. But the Pentagon was reluctant to do it itself because it was a hanging offense still. And in case there was, the bioweapon, in case the Patriot Act was regarded as, as irrelevant, was found to be irrelevant as a court, it was a big jeopardy to start doing this. So they took the $2 billion a year, $2.2 billion, and instead of doing it themselves, they sent it over to NIH, to NIAID, and they made Anthony Fauci the spear tip of bioweapons development in our country. And they gave him a 68% raise attached to his military research. So he had to do this research. He had no choice. And then in 2014, when three of the bugs escaped from his labs, and those escapes were highly publicized, and Congress had hearings on them, etc. 300 scientists sent letters to President Obama begging him to shut down Anthony Fauci. And Obama ordered Fauci to stop all of his experiments. 18 of these gain-of-function experiments that were shut down, Obama ordered to be shut down in 2014. Did Fauci do it? No, he did not. He defied the president and continued with those experiments, but he began moving his operations offshore to China out of the oversight of nosy federal officials and by the Cambridge Working Group, which was a group of 300 scientists that had been alarmed by his labs. They had written Obama saying one of his bugs is going to escape and it's going to cause a global pandemic. So they started funneling money to Wuhan, but it wasn't, Fauci, they put a total of $26 million in there. But the biggest funder was USAID, which is a CIA operation. So it was the CIA that was putting money into, and DARPA and other Pentagon agencies that were funneling the most money in for gain-of-function studies in Wuhan. And so then, I'm going to go back a little. During this period, and this is the chapter in my book that I think is most alarming to people, which is the CIA was sponsoring, beginning in May of 2001, 5 months before the anthrax attacks, they sponsored a series of pandemic simulations. And those pandemic simulations involved, all of them involved, there were CIA officials in each one. The CIA, James Woolsey, the deputy director, April Haynes was in some of them, many other CIA officials who I named in my book. And each one of them had something in common. They ignored the pandemic preparedness protocols that had been agreed upon by the CDC, by WHO, by the European Medical Agency, by the National Health Service in the UK, of what you do in a pandemic, because all of those protocols said you never lock down the public. You look for therapeutic drugs that are off the shelf, that are effective against these diseases. You get people to strengthen their immune systems. You quarantine with vitamin D and zinc and these kind of protocols. You isolate the sick. You quarantine the sick. You protect the vulnerable, but you let society continue operating. That's what everybody in the health field agreed upon. But the military and spy agencies had a different pandemic protocol, which is outlined in these series, and I go through all of them in my book. And they were the inverse of what we would do of medicine. They were about locking down subjects, about using these pandemics as a pretext for clamping down totalitarian controls. Yeah. And the last one of these was in 2019 in October. And it was hosted by Bill Gates, by Fauci, and by April Haynes. And interestingly, by George Gale, who is the head of the Chinese CDC in New York City. And any of you, I'm sure a lot of you have gone and looked at this on YouTube. It's called Event 201. And the fourth simulation that day, the last one, is all about how do you use the pandemic as a pretense for clamping down for abridgments of freedom of speech, and particularly, how do you stop people from talking about a lab leak as the source of these viruses? Now, this is in October 2019. None of us at that time had ever heard of COVID. We now know that COVID was almost certainly circulating by mid-September. On September 12th, the Chinese government kicked down the door of the Wuhan lab, brought in General Wei, which is a bioweapons expert from the People's Army, to run the lab and removed all the data function studies from their public-facing websites and all of the genomic sequences from all the viruses. The Chinese government clearly knew that the virus was circulating in September. So a month later, you have this. That same week, Bill Gates, who was overseeing this simulation, made bought 1.1 million shares of BioNTech vaccine, which later became the Pfizer vaccine. He then sold that, almost all that stock, 87%, 2 years later, at a $242 million profit. And a week after that, he publicly announced the vaccine didn't work. And this is what you call a pump and dump scheme. Because he was the guy who was on TV with his minion, Peter Hotez, who took $52 million from Gates for his Gates made his institution. So you had the pair of them pumping up the stock for 2 years and then dumping it a week before he goes on TV and says, oh, it didn't work after all. So, this Event 201, George Gale, who's the head, who clearly at that point, if anybody in China knew there was a virus, escaped. It was him. He's the coronavirus expert from China. He's the head of their CDC. He's engaged in an hour-long discussion with April Haynes about how do we clamp down to stop anybody from talking about the lab leak virus. How do we get the social media sites to censor people and deplatform them? And they talk about that. April Haynes says, we not only have to censor people, we have to flood the zone. This is what she said, flood the zone with authoritative voices denying the lab leak. That's what happened. And the New York Times, which is in this room today, I'm not saying the reporter who was here. She's a very sweet person by all accounts. But the Times itself did, and it's irresponsible. It's not journalism. It is propaganda at that point. So, what we saw was this involvement and then what happened? Vanity Fair. The people are saying, well, where did the virus come from? The press is all saying, whatever you say, we know wherever it came from, we know it didn't come from the Wuhan lab. So the government, Mike Pompeo, that was the head of the Department of State at that time, says we're going to do an investigation. He tells 4 of his agencies, find out where this is coming from. Vanity Fair does the article of what happened. In spring, intelligence, all of these 4 groups from the Department of State are in a room saying, holy cow, we figured out that the very experiments that could have created this were being funded by NIH and were being done at that lab. And a guy comes in from the intelligence agency, Christopher Park, and says, shut it all down. We got to stop doing this. This is going to implicate the U.S. government. And despite that evidence in Vanity Fair, the American press continues to report it didn't come from the lab, when obviously nobody knew. Well, then a year later, the Republicans in Congress are saying to Biden, you gotta figure out whether this came from the Wuhan lab. So Biden says, okay, we're gonna get the intelligence agencies, we gotta look into that. And who does he appoint to run that operation? April Haynes. So she then publishes the whitewash saying, whatever happened, we can't figure it out. We do not know. And of course, I think it's 450 pages with 449 redacted or something like that. I'm not going to stand on that. I know when it came out, that's what it was. So, we need to ask ourselves, Americans, about what is the role of public health? Who is supposed to be running public health? And why are the intelligence agencies have any involvement in public health? And at the same time, they've been practicing for year after year after year how to use a public health crisis to dismantle our Constitution, to clamp down totalitarian controls. They did it right out in the open, and it's all published. When COVID first hit, where I live now in California, there were surfers on Zuma Beach, and the police were sent down there to get them out of the water, give them $1,000 tickets, and send them home so they could get COVID. Because they weren't getting COVID out there. We know by then that COVID spread indoors. And we know that vitamin D, which is sunlight, comes from sunlight, protects you against COVID. So what we were doing was the inverse of medicine. The health department in Los Angeles went down to Venice Beach and scattered sand on the half pipes so nobody could skate on them, to get them off the beach and into their homes. They went to Compton and they padlocked all of the basketball courts. And if they couldn't padlock the court, they removed the rim. And they put people in a place where COVID was much more likely to harm them. And this is the only time in history, the only respiratory virus in history, where you would go to the hospital with symptoms of COVID and a positive PCR test, and the hospital would say, you go home, there's nothing that can be done. There's no early treatment. You go home till your lips turn blue and you can't breathe, and then come back here. And each time they did that, it was a super spreader event. This was the inverse of medicine. And we need, if we have illness in this country, if we have sickness, we need to have a medical response and a public health response. And not the response where Americans feel that their civil rights are being taken from them. Freedom. We need a media that is going to go back to its traditional role of speaking truth to power. I had a reporter last night saying to me that she said, well, what if your words are misinterpreted by people? And I said, that's not my business. My business is to tell the truth. And Americans are adults. We're grown-ups. We live in a democracy. Part of the responsibility of living in democracy is figuring out what the truth is and then debating about it and thinking about it. But when the press thinks that their job is to protect you from dangerous misinformation, they are manipulating you. That is manipulation. That is not press. That is not journalism. It has nothing to do with journalism. The job of the press is to be the fierce defender of truth, no matter what the cost of that truth is. I think you're going to sit right now and sit down and shut up. So I'm going to say, I'll leave you with the last thought, which is that everything that we care about in this country, everything that made this country great, and made it unique, and made it an exemplary democracy, it all comes from one thing, which is freedom. And if we don't have freedom, we have nothing in this country. And there was a generation of Americans, and many of them were from this state, people like John Stark, people from right next door, Ethan Allen, and many, many others, thousands of people from this state who gave their lives during the American Revolution, who sacrificed their property, their wealth, their status, their relationship so that we could enjoy the civil rights and the constitutional rights that made this country a great nation. And we cannot allow somebody to take those rights away from us. We have to be willing to make the same sacrifice that our ancestors made for us to make sure that our children enjoy those same rights, those same liberties. So thank you all for standing for liberty.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. So we're going to open up the side for ventilation here to get some air. And I'd now like to introduce Carla Garricky, the head of the Free State Project, to open it up for questions.